So one of the craziest things that I've learned in the last few years, 12 actually, that I've been learning and diving into artist blacksmithing, almost nobody knows how to hammer. And you probably immediately dismiss that as some sort of a carpenter's ego hyperbole overstatement, but it's not that. People don't know how to hammer because people don't and haven't for decades grown up hammering. You've heard the stories about grandpa or maybe your dad straightening nails. You know, there would be buckets of bent nails and they would be straightening them out. The dad was putting the kid to a task that may be somewhat productive because nails were more expensive then, relatively speaking, than they are now. They're cheap. The other thing that was happening was the kid was learning how to hammer. If I gave the average 40-year-old man off the street today a bucket full of bent nails and asked him to straighten them, he would quit in disgust after about the 10th one. My 30 years as a carpenter prior to becoming a blacksmith was just a huge advantage because I showed up being able to hammer. I started carpentering in the mid-1970s. Nail guns were just beginning to show up. And so I drove a lot of nails, as many as an old-time carpenter, perhaps. In fact, certainly. And there's a type of muscle memory that only develops with thousands and tens of thousands of hours spent doing a task. So here's the takeaway for you carpenters who want to be a blacksmith. You have a huge competitive advantage. You're going to show up at an anvil and you're going to pick up a hammer, in this case a 3-pound crosspeen, and you're not going to be afraid to use it. And besides that, you'll be able to hit the same spot over and over. You'll be able to control the pitch or the angle of the hammer face relative to the work, and you're not going to wear out. Not so for the rest of you. So if you're interested and you're thinking of blacksmithing, the first best thing you can do for yourself or for your teenage son, or maybe you got an 8-year-old boy that's been watching Forged in Fire and playing video games and he wants to make a sword, and you want to encourage that, the secret to blacksmithing is hammering. If you want to learn how to hammer, you get a piece of stove wood, firewood, a block of wood. If you can't buy it in the round, then get an end of a beam or a glulam beam, and buy yourself 50 pounds of 8-penny nails, sinkers, drive in really easy, and get yourself a hammer, an S-twing would be fine, and drive every one of those nails. And once it starts coming easy, do it faster. Then start limiting the number of blows. Then start going from one to the next, to the next, to the next. And then when one starts to bend, don't bend it over, but with the angle of your hammer face, straighten it up and drive it in. Driving nails is the best practice you can do for becoming a blacksmith. Think of this. You can hammer pretty well with your index finger extended. You can even hammer okay with these 2 fingers extended. But try this. You cannot control that hammer unless you control this fulcrum. Most of your hammering needs to happen in this joint. The secondary joint in hammering is your elbow. And your shoulder only comes into play when you're really getting with it, or maybe driving a concrete stake, or you're working on a big piece of iron and you're trying to move a lot of metal. But for most of the hammering you do, it's your wrist and the action of flinging the hammer exactly where you want it that is getting the work done. Practice that. Think about that. Now the other thing you can think about is when you're standing at your anvil, or for that matter driving nails into a bottom plate, banging together a wall, the hammer should begin its blow from somewhere around your ear. You don't start up here unless you're really getting violent, and unless, you start a nail like this, or maybe you've got a finished nail and so it's down here, but most of the time the hammer initiates its trip to its point of impact from somewhere around the side of your head. Now some people will tell you that your thumb should rest on the back of the hammer. I don't find that's an advantage, although sometimes when I'm getting right down to it, I think that my brain kind of learns that on a short stroke I need a little more snap in that fulcrum that's just happening in the palm of my hand. But for most use, I find myself hammering with my thumb alongside the hammer. If you pick up a hammer that's too heavy for you, you don't feel like you can control it out on the end of the handle, choke up. It's traveling slower. You're not discharging the energy, but you've got lots more control. So the whole range of the handle is available to you when you're deciding how much control you need versus how much power. Choking up on a hammer does not call into question your manhood, okay? If you'll watch some of the videos on YouTube about the process of making a samurai sword, you will see that those traditional Japanese samurai swordsmiths use these ridiculously sort of big hammers. They look like in the 8 to 10 pound range, maybe. They're very weight forward, and they've got little short handles. And those guys are choked right up next to the head, and they're doing their work, and they're controlling that point of impact beautifully. They're overlapping the hammer blows. The angle of the hammer face relative to the work is perfect. Use the hammer you can get the work done with that you can control. If you need to choke up, choke up. What it boils down to is this. The energy is discharged at the point of impact between the hammer and the nail, or between the hammer and the iron. And that point of impact is all that matters. It doesn't matter really how fast you're swinging it, although that's more or less power. It doesn't really matter how you're holding your hand if you can make it happen. The point of impact relative to the direction you want to move the material. So with this in mind, you'll recognize that the orientation of the hammer face, when it gets there, is just as important as where the hammer face hits. I mean, you can bend that nail over by glancing it off and missing it. You can bend that nail by hitting it with the hammer at an angle, okay? So when you're swinging, you're thinking not just of where it's going, but of how the hammer face is oriented relative to the point of impact and relative to the long axis of the nail, okay? If the nail's like that, you have to hit square to the long axis. That becomes a big thing when your nail becomes long. I mean, when the length to diameter ratio changes a lot, I mean, it would be pretty easy if you were driving this into a piece of oak to bend that thing over, wouldn't it? Here's the takeaway. There's more to hammering than you think. The only way to be able to hammer is to hammer. To some of you young carpenters, you're functioning on the job site, you're good with a nail gun, practice your hammering. If you have a choice, if it's not a time-sensitive moment, pull a nail out of your bags, put it into the work, and drive it. Pay attention to what's happening. Refine that skill. Reclaim some of what the guys just a few years ahead of you would have had in their hands automatically the first day on the job, that it may take a young fellow now a long time to develop. Practice, practice, practice.